So pretty much this bike is mechanically sound now. The brakes work great. All the components are all tuned properly. Everything is working fine. Sounds so great. Hey guys, we're going to be replacing the brakes on my commuter bike today. As you guys have heard in many numerous videos, the brakes sound horrible. They're like, and I thought it was because like the rear pad is all the way wore out. The front, not so much, but the front is making just as much noise. Now, I tried to investigate this. I already took off the front wheel, took apart the brake pads, replaced the brake pads on the front wheel, because I wanted to kind of see, you know, what was going on and kind of get an understanding before I made this video. That way you guys knew, hey, you know, this is what was going on. And one of the biggest things that was a big problem with this was the fact that whoever had this bike last put the wrong brake pads on it. As you can see, the rotor started to grind a little bit. There's several markings on the rotor that you need to kind of take into consideration. The rotation of the rotor, which is pretty self-explanatory. And another thing on mine that I had to pay attention to is that it takes resin pads only. Now this is very important because there are two types of pads out there, at least two types that I know. There's your semi-metallic pads and then there's your resin pads. And resin pads are kind of like an organic type of a compound. They're softer. Depending on the metallurgy of your rotor, semi-metallic pads may be needed or organic pads may be needed. There's a whole science to this stuff, but you really need to put the right kind of brake pads on. That's the whole key to everything, the right kind of brake pads. And whoever had this bike last put semi-metallic pads on a rotor that they were supposed to put resin type of pads on. So that's kind of disappointing. I bought these Shimano. They are, the brakes that I have on this bike are TRP. These Shimano are compatible with TRP. They are resin brake pads. You can tell on the front. You need to check your packaging and make sure that they have resin on them. You'll see all these symbols right here, and you'll see one that says resin. Before you ever buy brake pads, you're going to have to look on your rotors and make sure the type of pads that you need. But if it needs a special type of pad like resin, it's going to tell you it needs resin pads. Now, bike shops have a liability, and the liability is simply this. They are going to tell you every single time, replace this when you get new pads. That is not necessary. Now, I'm warning you right now, do everything at your own risk. Brakes are extremely important. The technical right way to do it is to replace the rotors and to replace the brake pads. But they want to sell me rotors that are $45 a piece plus the brake pads, and you know, it's ridiculous. These brake rotors are more than thick enough. They are not scarred up, so for the most part they are going to work fine. You may want to use some light grit sandpaper on the surface of the rotor. Just sand it around the seating surfaces, and you know, some really kind of like an emery cloth type of sandpaper. After you sand it, taking kind of like a torch, like maybe like a little heating torch to kind of burn off any contaminants, or using alcohol. I'm going to use alcohol. I don't really care for heating these things up because I think that, you know, it's a pain in the ass because you burn yourself too much, and I'm not going to even bother with that. But what I am going to do is sand it off, and I'm going to clean it with alcohol before I stick it back on the bike. Because I'm all about not spending money if I don't freaking have to. Now, bike shop's going to tell you, they're going to say replace this and replace that. And they're telling you that because they want it to be 100% safe, and they don't want any, well, you told me I could get by with the brake pads and the rotors were bad, and now I crashed my bike and I hurt myself and you're liable. And that's why bike shops are always going to tell you just replace the rotors as well. I'm telling you, do it at your own risk, but in my opinion, I don't need to replace the rotors. I'm going to clean them and they'll be perfectly fine for a whole nother set of brake pads. And then maybe the next pad change, I'll actually put a set of rotors on it. Okay, first things first. On the back brakes, I got to take off the wheel. So you unclamp the clamp and you twist this. Once the wheel is loose, you pop the wheel off. kind of hard to do one-handed, but you hold up your derailleur, you push this, you want to kind of lift that chain off of the sprockets like that, see? And you should be able to lift the wheel right off and set it out of your way. There are two types of rotors out there that I've seen. They have ones that have bolts, usually a Torx bolt, but regardless, they have bolts, and you just unloosen those bolts to take the rotor off. This one is a little bit different. This has got a center locking rotor, and the way you would do this is you would unscrew the axle, and as soon as the axle is loosened, you take it out and you set it aside. Then you're going to need a tool like this, and you put that into your hole. You line up the splines like that. Then you get yourself a crescent wrench like this one. Then you would take your crescent wrench and you would just wrench it off like normal. That will undo that, like that, you see? Put that somewhere. And now the rotor just pops off. Once the brake rotor is off, you can sand it, replace it, do whatever you feel is necessary. It's your life that you're taking into your own hands. So if your brake rotor needs to be replaced, replace it. If it doesn't, you make that judgment call, but it's up to you. Me, I know enough about rotors and brakes that I know that my brakes are going to be fine with these rotors. At worst case scenario, they'll make a slight little squeaking noise that I could probably live with. Next, what you're going to want to do is take your caliper off. You're going to want to get yourself a set of hex keys like this one. The ball type are the best ones. I usually get a good set of long ones. That way if I need to torque on anything, I can do that. Now, I don't know if you can see that or not. Right here, you can see that the pad material on this side is almost completely gone and it's wearing into the metal. That's not good. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this caliper off. So what I'm going to do is undo these bolts right here that hold the actual caliper on. There's two bolts here that hold the mounting bracket on. You don't necessarily need to take those off, so I'm just going to undo these. I'm going to show you why I like the ball-headed ones, because if you have something obstructing your way and you can't get on it straight, you can go at it. You can get on the bolt head at an angle like this and then turn the screw off. And you can see how much thinner that inner pad is. There's several different designs. This is a hydraulic mechanical, meaning it's mechanical up into this point, and then it's hydraulic right from here. Once the caliper is loose, you want to undo this cable. Now, the reason why you undo the cable on this particular bike is because of the fact that it'll allow you to be able to compress those pistons. There's a piston on this side and a piston on this side. And with the cable tension on it, it's not going to allow you to compress back. Every time you press one piston down, the other is going to pop out. So in order to do that, you want to take that cable off of there. So you undo this bolt and undo that cable. Okay, next you got to take this bolt out, and it's a 3mm hex bolt. Most mechanical disc brakes and hydraulic brakes will have a little cotter pin on one side that just snaps into this little groove right here. So you snap it in place and you pull it out. This keeps this pin from, working its way back out. Now, after you got this cotter key off, you got to undo the actual brake pad retaining pin. You get your 3mm and you undo it like this. And then the whole thing comes out. After that, you're able to lift the brake pads right out of there. Unless it's really jammed up like mine appears to be. Now let's take a look at these pads. You see there's pad material left on that one. This one, completely thin and wore out. That was long overdue for a bad replacement. All right, get our new pads. throw that anywhere. You have a little clip similar to this one, and you have two pads. You see these holes? That's where that retaining bolt that we just took out, that's where it goes to keep the pads from sliding out the bottom of the caliper. What you want to do is you want to put this on the inner side of the pad like that. It should slide right in. See? Then you want to take the other set of pads and put it on there as well. So that basically you can have that spring tension. After that, you got to compress the piston of the caliper back in. Now, if you have mechanical disc brakes, there will be a big hex head on the side of this. And you just undo that hex head and the piston will draw back as you're undoing that hex head. In this case, these are hydraulic, so you can't do that. Hydraulic, you just put a tire lever tool in there in between the and you compress that piston. You just push that piston back. It helps if you have one like this. That's a spoon. These are actually for tire levers, but they work great on brakes as well, because it allows me to get that leverage in there that I need to compress that piston all the way. After that piston is compressed all the way, now you can start putting things back together like the pads. You take your set of brake pads that you got, that sandwich, and you just shove it back down in there. Pretty even. And the hole to that top of that pad should line up right here. So you want to kind of wiggle those pads until you get that hole to line up. And then you want to put the guide pin back in. You put it back through the front like this. Sometimes it won't go because it ain't lined up perfectly. You just move the pads a little bit until it goes in like that. And now you're going to screw it back in with your 3mm. And this keeps those pads from coming right out the bottom. Tighten it, not super tight, just snug, a little bit past. After that, you're pretty much done with that, and you're going to put the wheel back on and do your adjustment on your cable. And you want to slide it back into place. Like that. And the next order of business is to put the caliper back on around the rotor, such as these, like that. And you're going to want to tighten it back up. Usually when these bolts have like a red film around them, that means it's got red Loctite. You should put more of that back on before you tighten up your caliper. That keeps the caliper bolts from backing out. You put both your caliper bolts back in, and then we're going to adjust the brake lever. Now, one way you can check whether your rotors are warped is if your pad is really close to the brake rotor and you turn your wheel and it spins freely and then stops. Like the rotor's warped, it will brush up against those pads. And you'll also feel a pulsation when you brake. That's another way to tell whether your brake rotors are warped. If they're not warped, you don't need to replace them. Just a little bit of sand off. If they're not too thin, there's a micrometer spec that you can measure, but I can tell just by looking at them that these have got about half, if not over half on them. So I think we're good on these. We can get by till one more brake job, so I think we'll be okay. Okay guys, the last order of business is to pull this cable tight. If this cable is loose, when you push the brake lever, it'll go all the way to your handle. And what you want to do is you want to take up that slack by pulling this cable down just enough to where you have a nice travel in your brake lever. So once you pulled the cable down, you take up that slack, you tighten your bolt, and your brake lever should go about halfway down. Okay, now that you've got your wheels back on, everything's back together, and you got your cables adjusted, your brakes feel good, it's time to go for a test drive. Now, here's the thing. You have to seat in the brakes. The first couple times you use them, they're not going to feel like they're going to stop at all. Okay, so we're going to go test drive the bike, and We're going to seat in the brakes, and that's going to be about it. So hopefully they sound much better than they did, and hopefully I can be safe and not have to have everybody looking at me when I come to a stop. Okay, the next step, what you want to do is you want to find a big hill, and you want to get going down that hill pretty damn fast, and then you want to give a couple of good hard, maybe 1 or 2 or 3 good hard brakes on the way down of a really steep hill. Okay, I just realized that first part did not film. I filmed the first part, not the downhill. Okay, the downhill is the second part. That's the hard braking. So I'm gonna film this over again, okay? The first thing you wanna do when you start seating in your brakes is you wanna barely put just the slightest little bit of resistance on your brakes, and you wanna ride like that for a little bit, just to heat up those brakes, to get them nice and hot. And then you let it cool off a little bit and do it again, maybe 2 or 3 times. And then you want to go to your downhills, which is what I just did. You want to go really fast and do 1 or 2 hard brakes. And pretty much after that, guys, your brakes should be seated in perfectly fine. And as you can hear, mine sound a hell of a lot better. I hear a slight hissing noise, which is what you should hear, not that grinding noise. So pretty much this bike is mechanically sound now. The brakes work great. All the components are all tuned properly. Everything is working fine. There's a couple of aesthetic things I want to do, but besides that, not too much. I think everything sounds so great. Everything works great, and I'm happy. I just got a few more things I want to do to this bike, and I'll be done. And then I could just ride it around and commute and do long trips with it. Anyway, guys, I'm gonna end the video here. If you guys got any comments or questions, leave them down in the comment and question section. Slap a like on the video if you like it, and I will talk with you guys later. Bye-bye.